I'm joined now by Chair of the Ministerial Advisory Committee on COVID-19, Professor Salim Abdool Karim. He has some brand new research with him on the downward trends, excess deaths and the second wave. Thank you very much for joining us this evening and for bringing your slides along so that we get a real mini lecture. We do like this on this program. So if we look at the first two slides, which I'm going to ask you to discuss together, it's the 7-day moving average of new cases up to the 2nd of September. It's the national and also the provincial breakdown. And as the layperson here, I see a very clear decline. Just talk us through those first two slides briefly.
Yeah, sure, Sally. Very good evening, and good evening to all the viewers. So when we look at our peak, we had about 24 cases per 100,000 people per day. That translated to just over 12,000. And now we are at a level where we are closer to around 4 cases per 100,000 per day. We want to get to about 1 case per 100,000 per day, because that's the level at which we would regard it as, very low level of transmission. But what is interesting is that when you look at this trend, initially I was somewhat hesitant about whether we could make a conclusion that, we definitely are on the decline. Now the evidence is quite sound and compelling. Every province has come down. You can see that all of the lines are overlapping right at the bottom, and the overall national trend is very clearly in the decline, and we are now at around 2,000 cases plus minus a day, and we need to get that down to around 600.
Okay, so that's really good news. No bump because of going down to level 2, or is it hard to say at this point?
So we had a bit of the slowing down. If you look at the curvature had a bit of a bump, and then it turned slightly. You can see that it just slowed. Yeah. The rate at which the decline was going just slowed, but it's continued to decline, and so it's actually very good news.
Wonderful. Let's move on now to the next slide, which is average daily tests and proportion of positive tests, which is quite interesting because obviously you can say, oh, we're doing less tests, that's why we're getting less positives, but it's the percentage of tests that are positive. That's my understanding anyway. Am I correct that at the peak, for every 100 tests done, 25 were positive, and that has now dropped drastically?
You're absolutely right, Sally. So the first thing to do is to look at how many tests we are doing. And you can see that at the peak we were doing about 46,000 tests or so per day in the week that we were at the peak. We are now doing around 18 to 20,000 tests per day. So it's come down substantially. And the reason why it's come down is that there's less demand for testing. But what's really important is to look at the proportion that are positive. And that is showing a very clear and consistent decline. From a peak of around 27%, we are now at around 11%. The World Health Organization sets a 10% boundary. So they would like to see at least 10 tests being done to get 1 positive result. And the reason for that is that for every positive person you find, you should expect that there will be a range of individuals, particularly contacts, that will be negative. So they would regard 10% as a level that you can be reasonably confident that you're doing enough testing. And so we are within that range right now, at around 1 positive test for every 10 tests that we do.
That's exceptionally good news. And I just want to look at the next slide, which is the 7-day on new cases, hospital admissions and deaths. And again, we can see that curve. So that just really reinforces everything you've told us now. Am I correct?
You're absolutely correct. So we don't want to go with just one indicator. We always want to look at consistency across the indicators. And so our admissions are coming down, our new cases are coming down, the percentage positive is coming down. Deaths you would expect to take longer. So because patients die, several weeks after they originally get the infection, we will continue to see a substantial number of deaths before that will follow the same trend. So you can see that deaths take longer to rise compared to how rapidly the cases rise. The deaths didn't rise in that way because of the lag. We see about a 2 to 3 week lag between cases rising and deaths rising. And so that trend is now quite clear, and we'll wait to see how the deaths decline over the next few weeks.
Let's move on to the next slide, because this for me is really interesting, because it's been such a contentious issue, not only here, but internationally as well. And this is the issue of excess deaths. And that is, my understanding, it's what you expect year on year, and then what happens. And the predicted deaths is that middle blue line. The recorded deaths, is my understanding, is the top, the red one, which shows a very clear rise in deaths. Now, obviously not all of it is due to COVID-19. Some of it is linked tangentially to COVID-19. Some of it's because people had heart attacks and didn't go to hospital, that sort of thing. But just talk us through the bottom line on excess deaths during this period, what it was.
Okay, so if we look at the period before the lockdown, you'll see that we have a slight excess in deaths. And that actually is true for January and February as well. We generally, this year, have had slightly more deaths than we would predict, and the predicted line is the blue one. So you would expect we would have slightly more deaths than predicted. But if you look at the periods under level 5, level 4, and level 3, you can see that actually what happened, particularly level 5 and level 4, we had far fewer deaths than we expected. Now, most of that, it seems to be associated with non-natural deaths. And we think that a lot of that relates to alcohol, decreased number of motor vehicle accidents, interpersonal violence. And so we actually saved something like, or not saved, but we had about 5,000 fewer deaths than we expected over that period from March to June. But as we reached the peak in the number of cases, the number of deaths started to rise. And you can see under level 3 in June, the level of excess deaths, that's the number of deaths that were recorded that were more than the predicted, was around 2,000. And the COVID-19 reported deaths was also around 2,000.
Yeah, exactly. So, and what's startling for me is that the bottom line is around 33,000 deaths, excess deaths, more than you would have expected in any given year for that period. And our actual deaths are around 14,000. Does that suggest we've actually underreported how many people have died from COVID-19 in this country?
Yeah, so if you look at level 3 plus, you can see that those numbers are slightly incorrect. So just ignore the actual numbers. During that
but the
period,
bottom line is correct.
Yes, the line right at the bottom. So the 32,555, that's the excess deaths. During that period, the actual reported number of deaths was around 12,000. So that means that there's a difference of around 20,000 deaths. And because it's roughly at the same time as the peak, it's likely that a sizable proportion of that 20,000 is due to COVID. So it means that we probably have somewhere around twice to thrice as many deaths as we have reported. And I think if you work around 2.5 to 3 times the reported number of deaths, you'll probably get to a more accurate estimate of the COVID deaths. And even at that level, even if it is twice as high or 2.5 times as high, that still gives South Africa quite a low case fatality rate compared to many other countries.
And now let's move on to our final slide, which really looks at second waves and how they happen. And I have to hurry you along, I'm afraid, because we are needing to move on. But it's interesting, if we look at Spain, that's a massive second wave. The other countries like Australia seems to have pulled back and controlled quite well. How are we able to predict a second surge in South Africa, bearing in mind that we do very different things to Spain, for example, when it comes to what we do over the festive season at the end of the year, that our seasons are at different times? Do you have a sort of a way of predicting if we're going to get a second wave, and when it's going to happen?
So the one thing about the second wave, when we study it across these different countries, there seems to be an association with some kind of event that leads to super spreading. If you look at Australia, their second wave was bigger than their first wave, and it occurred largely around a set of cases in Melbourne. Belgium had a much smaller second wave. In Spain, they have a tsunami going on right now, let alone a wave. It's just so many because they opened up for the holidays. I think in South Africa, we need to be very careful as we get into our summer, as we have much more movement. We'll need to just ensure we follow the rules and wear our masks and distance and wash our hands to avoid a second wave.
Yes, absolutely. But good news is that for those of us who are going to be on the beach in December, we know that the virus dies quite easily in sunlight, because you've told us that already. Well, thank you.
That's correct.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to chat to you, Professor Salim Abdool Karim. Of course, he's the chair of the Ministerial Advisory Committee on COVID-19.